Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can be on time. I just don't like us to be late. Hi, and welcome to our January 17th Financial Town Hall. Just Ask Jen. We are excited to be here January the 17th talking about having our money conversations and talking about the budget, the fiscal year 24 budget building cycle. So we are joined on stage today with special guests. But before that, let's get through how you can join us if you're sitting in the audience. I know there's a lot of people here, but if you're sitting in the audience or if you are joining us online, we welcome your participation and engagement. And if you're on the Blue Jeans app, please feel free to click the hand icon if you want to ask us a question. If you're on Blue Jeans and you want to send us a chat, please feel free to put your question on Blue Jeans in the chat, and one of our moderators will be able to accommodate. Also, if you're in person, join us here at the podium so that you can come on down and get your question asked in person. And if you're on Facebook, feel free to type your question in the comment section during the live stream, and we've got people here that will answer you, that will ask the question. They'll acknowledge you, ask the question here live, so that we can get you an answer. So before we start how we do what we do, let's go around and introduce who we have been joined at our faux fireplace chat, fireside chat today. We've got our treasurer, Jen.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jennifer Wagner, and the Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer for the district. Next to my right.
Hi, Eve Bolton, Board Member and Finance Chair. Thanks for being here.
And
Irene to Wright, Superintendent of Schools. Thank you.
And I'm Dr. Kareem Moffitt, Board Member. So let's just kind of jump right in, Jen. Today we're talking about money, as we always do, and we are talking about budget. So how do we start?
So thank you. So tonight we are talking about the budget building cycle, which is very long and sometimes complicated. And so we wanted to have a conversation tonight about expectations, and then you get feedback, and then we'll, as we progress through the process, we'll come back and do some more town halls. But the cycle starts every year in the month of October for the next school year with taking a student extract of enrollment by school, by grade, and by condition. And we use that information to do student projections. So how many students at each school, at each grade level, and what their needs are. If they're students with disabilities or English language learners or gifted, career tech, and something else I'm forgetting. But we start that in October. We feed that information into staffing formulas that are designed through the collective bargaining agreement process or state and federal law, and sometimes board policy. And then we produce a projected staffing up for the schools. And the schools go to work and have some work to do, and we'll go through some of that detail in later slides. But in the meantime, the board is talking about what are the board priorities for the year. And if we had a strategic plan, it would be that year's scope of strategic plan, but we're in the process of kicking off a new cycle. So we'll be paralleling these. So we talk about what our budget priorities are. We start aligning our financial resources in the budget to support those outcomes. We have a series of public engagement processes, and then we have to have an adopted budget by June 30, so that Hamilton County, I have to file that appropriations resolution with the Hamilton County before I cut the first check. She's laughing because she's predicting that we're going to do another temporary 90-day appropriation. We're allowed to do a temporary appropriation, and we've had to do that in the last couple of years, which is quite difficult and challenging, but sometimes necessary. So we are going to work our hardest to meet the June 30 deadline. Oh, we did meet it this year. Yes, we did. So it was prior to 2 years that we had to do temporary appropriations.
So before you move on, explain what does that mean that you would have to do a temporary appropriations? Why would those, what conditions would be existing for that to have to happen?
So the first time we did it under my realm is the year COVID hit, and the state reduced our state funding formula by $8 million, just like that, in the month of April or May. And so we immediately had to start shaving back a budget. But we also didn't know what we were going to operate like with COVID because we were shut down. We didn't know when we were going to be open school and how are we going to pay everybody and how to transport them and how to keep them safe. And so there was a lot of plans that had to happen. And so the state will allow us to do a temporary budget up to 90 days to help us get through that process while we figure out the rest of the rules. And so that was a good question.
Okay.
The board approves the budget in June 27th this year, through an appropriations resolution, and it's at the total amount of the fund level, but we always produce much more detailed information for the schools and the public and the board to evaluate how we're going to spend our money. And we have plans for even doing some really cool stuff this year. So next slide. So the budget target for the general fund is always based off of the November forecast. And if you remember at the last town hall, we talked a lot about the forecast. And so the trick is creating a budget target, a spending plan, so to speak, so that it maintains a cash balance for the next 2 years. If we show a deficit, then the state will come down and start making spending decisions for us, and we don't want that to happen. So while we always want to do a lot of really cool things, and we always try to budget more than we can possibly accomplish because we all have these great ideas on what to spend money on, we never really get to accomplish it all. But so there's a fine balance of not allowing the budget to grow too fast. And so we go through it, we have control over that. So if we develop a budget and we see that we're spending faster than we anticipated for the year, we do have the ability to stop spending money on non-discretionary things, or discretionary items, sorry. So it's a challenge to come up with the right budget target to support strategic initiatives while maintaining compliance and with shrinking resources. So on that, I think I'm turning over the next slide to Ms. Bolton, or yes.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. And just to get my oar in the water on the reason to go to August is that I think the exciting and challenging thing about this year's budget is that I think we all, either in front of ourselves or behind ourselves, are understanding this is probably going to be a transformative budget that might require perhaps more considerations and larger decisions sometimes than we have made in the past. So it's very exciting, very challenging, and we're thrilled that the community wants to be involved with this. As we move forward, we kind of start large and then go a little bit more detailed. And as you can see on the slide, we're trying to put together what our administration calls the investment priorities. And that starts with you. It starts with these great town halls, which were the idea of both our treasurer and also Dr. Moffitt. I think it's great to have the community involvement. We'll have more opportunities again and again and again for that. And then also the board has spent any number of months, I think it's all 7 or so months, putting together the kinds of strategic goals that we set, and with the help of the administration and with our efforts to also through our focus groups that some of you might recall, that we had a couple of months ago in determining the goals. And then also something very new this year that I think has been a great addition this year is the adding of the guardrails. And the guardrails are actually, as some of you will recall and have heard us at board meetings, this is the statement of values that we believe that the community holds and that we want reflected in what we do and what we decide. There's 6 of them. I'm not going to go through all of the 6, but as you start to think in terms of it, it's more than goals. It's also how we all want to be able to behave and achieve those goals under certain parameters. And the sentence starts with the superintendent will not do certain things. And we didn't like that language, but it's kind of goes with the governance procedure. We know our superintendent wouldn't be doing these sorts of things, but we committed to memory. We committed to satisfy the needs and how shall I say, reassure the community that their values are going to be here. One is won't ignore the fact that this district is built on the whole child concept. Won't allow any kind of discriminatory actions in discipline that somehow reflect a lack of cultural awareness. Another thing that we have said is that we want district communication to be very responsive, and we want it to be true. We want it to be transparent. Witness what we're doing tonight in all these efforts regarding our town halls and other things. Also, to propose or recommend the acquisition and distribution of resources that somehow is not equitable. And remember, equitable is not equality necessarily, but it is meeting the students and the needs where they are and making sure that we have the proper use of our resources. And then also something that's kind of here, I'll read directly, ignore district-wide chronic absenteeism, and you all can help us with that, as at each school site, paying special attention to family involvement. Then in pursuit of equity, shall not ignore the value and number of community partnerships, community access to facilities, and decision-making at our school sites. So kind of study those guardrails. I think it will give you inspiration, and I think it'll also help us move forward. And I think now I turn it over to our illustrious superintendent, who has the middle part of this program. Okay. She was out walking in the neighborhood today.
Yes,
so a little concerned when I saw her on Facebook, but she reassured us she was just coming to and from a meeting.
That's right. It was great. It was right across the street at Children, so it was right behind us. Okay, so as we think about the building of the budget, and as our treasurer shared, it really becomes a multi-month process. It's really something that we look at throughout the year, and our process this year started in October. And so we have currently our board adopted goals, which our board member Bolton discussed. That's really where the board has talked about. These are the things that we're focused on right now. These are the priorities. And so I would like to add here that these are not the only things that we're focused on as a district, but it's important that we recognize that we're elevating. These are the board adopted goals as we prepare for the next several years and looking at where our students are and student outcomes. And so those five areas, and they really cross all grade levels as we think about it, but those 5 areas are 3rd grade reading proficiency, 6th grade reading proficiency, and the gap that exists currently between our students as we think about both equity and equality, the gap that currently exists. Our Algebra 1 first-time test takers, and that was born out of an area that many don't always understand, is Algebra 1 is a course that our students have to pass in order to graduate. So we call it a gatekeeper in terms of graduation. Generally, our students are in 9th grade when they take Algebra 1. And so if a child takes Algebra 1 in 9th grade and they don't pass Algebra 1 in 9th grade, they have other options to retake it, but it starts them behind where they should be in terms of preparing for graduation. The next is making sure that we are giving our students options. We know currently we focus on the 3 E's, enlist, employ, and enroll. And when we think about both enrolling and looking at our certifications, we want students to graduate from Cincinnati Public Schools the certification already so that they can immediately enter into the world of work. And if they're going to college, we want them to enter into college already having interaction with college before they graduate. So we want to give them those opportunities currently in our school district with a special focus around our minority populations. And last but not least, in terms of our board adopted goals, is graduation rate. At the end of it all, it's important that our students are graduating. And we know there are a lot of factors that impact graduation, but we want to make sure that we are keeping our eye focused on graduation and providing the necessary strategies and supports so that our students are moving across the stage in that 4-year cohort that they should. From these areas, we then begin to look at specific priorities as we begin the process of building the strategic plan. And when we think about the strategic plan, we're really talking about the how. The board has given pretty clear expectations around the what are the goals. The community has engaged with the board. The board did a lot of engagement sessions with the community around guardrails, and that's really something that we'll call the values, as Board Member Bolton just referenced. And so then it becomes the how, and the how is really as the leader of the district, how are we looking at making sure that we reach those student-focused outcomes. And so right now, we're looking at a few areas and making sure that we're addressing the guardrails and addressing the needs around our student-focused outcomes. Academic achievement is first and foremost. I do believe that that's one of the reasons that we exist as an organization, is to make sure that when our students come, they leave us better prepared than they were when they came in. The whole child, we heard that very clearly, very loudly, and as an educator, almost 30 years doing this work, it's important that we recognize that our students have many gifts and talents. And we want to make sure that we're capitalizing on those gifts and talents, and we're also elevating them through the experiences that they have in school. Transportation is a big one for us. I don't think that there's anyone that's listening right now that has not heard something about transportation for us this year. And I won't go into transportation much, as we do have those town halls as well, but or those community roundtables as well. But it's important that we are really looking at how we think through transportation, so that we are ensuring that our students are getting to school on time and they're getting there safely. High school transformation is a big one for us, and all of the data points that we look at in terms of high school really tell us that there's some intensive work that needs to happen in our high schools and in our high school environments to make sure that we have students that are getting what they need from that overall experience. The assistant principal expansion as a priority is thinking about the expectations of working with principals and the level of accountability that is now happening in terms of working with principals. And in doing that, it's really important that we do two things. One, there is someone to assist in terms of doing that work in the building, but two, that we're simultaneously training the next level of assistant principals. It's important that we're training the assistant principals so that when there's a need for a principal, it's important that we have someone already on the bench to do that. And what better way to learn that is by learning as you go and being a part of that process. And last but not least is our school programming. We're calling it right now School Programming 2030. We did a pretty extensive audit where we audited all of our school programs across the district. We really looked at the areas of focus and the core areas of focus and how we were providing support in those spaces, and then what we would look at doing as we move forward in terms of making sure that our students have just the wealth of experiences that we want them to have.
And all of that you described is great. I want to make sure that we also say that all of those goals and priorities is for the general fund targeted budget of $565.2 million, correct?
That's correct. So that's our general fund target. But as we think about priorities, we've not talked about our federal dollars, but even as we think about priorities, our priorities of our federal dollars are also to support and augment the programs in schools where our students have the greatest needs. And so it's still aligned with those same priorities as well.
Yes, I gotcha. So I just wanted to, because it's all about money. So everything that you described with regard to the goals and your priorities was proposed on the budgeted amount of $565.2 million, right?
Right.
Okay.
So that's the current general fund targeted budget.
Right.
And so those areas would be the areas that we're looking for as a part of that.
Okay.
But I just wanted to add the other about the Title I, about the title budgets.
Just always want to clarify for the community so that they align with how that ties into the money. So, gotcha.
Just to be clear, our current general fund budget is $613 million. And so next year's target is considerably smaller. And we've already taken steps to start looking at areas of spend that aren't producing the income or the outcome that we want. And so we're trying to shift our financial resources to the places where we get the biggest bang for our buck. And so we've been working very hard together to come up with this return on investment evaluation of everywhere where we spend money. Fine.
So in our board policy, we have, and I really applaud the board for being forward thinking in terms of how we're thinking about equity, but we have a board policy around equity budgeting, and that's to make sure that annually that we are allocating funds, financial capital, and human resources equitably. I think the question becomes, what does equity look like? And as our treasurer always says, everyone wants equity until it's not equal, right? So it's really going through the process of making sure that we're working with our teams, we're working with principals, so that they really understand the differences and the nuances of how their allocations are done, where those dollars come from, what areas are being considered as we think about what's happening in schools and how we're providing those resources. So we look at a zero-based budgeting where we're looking at both our budget and our forecasted revenues, and then our contracts. Where are we with contracts? What are we looking at in our key performance indicators or our KPIs? What is it costing us per student? And what are the measures of success? So, you know, in the world of education, we don't always like to talk about return on investment, but it is important for us to be good fiscal managers and think about, this is what we're spending our dollars on. And so if we're spending our dollars on this, what outcome is it providing for us? What outcome is it providing for students, to make sure that we're using that as a gauge to determine whether or not we continue to spend in that area.
If I could add something, and I'm doing this basically to kind of make it very clear to the public that this incredibly difficult process, for the most part, besides getting our guardrails and getting our goals, and also the superintendent establishing for the administration these particular targets, fully everyone understand that at this time the board and mostly the community have not been fully engaged. You've participated, you've been involved more than I can ever remember in my 15 years, but at least through our process that we've gone through. But when I say, or when I said earlier that this is going to be a transformative budget, it really is. As Jen pointed out, even the cuts from this year to next are significant. And in the reduction of federal opportunity for dollars, it's also changed. And there are a lot of things happening within the district that are in a state of motion. And so we really encourage people to be very, very involved and to communicate interests that they may have. But the administration has done a great job getting us to this level of platform as we become even more widely engaged as a community and as a board for priorities for what's best for our students and our staff, and also facing salary reopeners for our unions. So this is a very challenging time, but we have the people in place to get it done.
So this slide really takes us through our history. So we talked about on the last slide that our board entered into a policy in 2016 around equity budgeting. And so this became the iteration of looking at what happens in terms of that equity budgeting. So for FY19, which would be our fiscal year 2019, there were several areas that were looked at as a part of equity. So as you're thinking about building the school-based budget, these were areas that were considered as a part of that budget, and many of them ultimately placed into that budget for FY19. And that included things like Vision 2020, which was where we were looking to go as a school district collectively for 2020, and really talking about overall programming. We think about My Tomorrow, and that was really making sure that we were offering the same types of experiences at our neighborhood schools as we were offering at our magnet schools and our Montessori schools, and continuing to look at how we were working with our special populations, so our students that were ELL students or students that were first language students, how we were addressing their needs, special education, and how we were addressing those as well. And so one of the big areas here in terms of thinking about equity as well, that's also very much a part of that whole child commitment, and where the board and the values that have come through our guardrails have really stood out this year as we begin our process, it was around arts and making sure that we have expanded arts offerings for students, that we have extracurricular activities for students as well, and that we're looking at what's happening in terms of cleanliness in buildings. So making sure that as we look across the board, I don't know why all of a sudden my phone has started talking, but as we're looking across the board, what are we doing to make sure that we're providing services to students and how those services look? And so from there, you see the different iterations from FY20, which offered an equity request form, which essentially meant that schools could request additional resources in each of those areas. And that continued through FY22. And then FY23, thinking about what are the budgeting tiers and how you're really looking at the resources that are available to schools and what those budgets would look like overall.
So just to kind of jump in for a second, if you wouldn't mind giving that to Board Member Bolton. Would you mind giving us just a little historical context, just a little bit of meat to that historical context and how we got to, with our new equity policy, at that time it was new, how did those things come about? How did we come up with Vision 2020? Like, how did we, what was the impetus behind those things being involved in equity?
Well, as was happening throughout, actually, North America, particularly, because Canada kind of led the way on this issue of equity. We began to kind of have some knowledge of that, and we decided that we would like to lead, and we thought our community would want us to lead on the equity piece. So we were, I believe, the first district in the state of Ohio to write the equity and excellence in education policy, and we're very proud of it. And what it really is part of this transformative budget, in that it isn't a matter only of formulas that are kind of generic across the district, which there are some of those that have to be, but that every school perhaps has, as Jen found out, and as the superintendent's mentioned, every different school might have different demands and different needs. And so you have to look in terms of budgeting as meeting where the needs are and distributing the resources. And they might be distributed somewhat differently based upon the needs of a student or of a school site or a program. And we're very proud of that. And we also, I think, as part of the equity piece, for sure, began to realize that it's a mind changer. It's a brain flipper, if you will, when you start to think in terms of how you meet individual needs. And again, we're proud that we led the state on that, but also we're proud that our administration has been doing work over a number of years, and certainly this year, to try to figure out just how you do that, because it does become controversial, and you have to find ways that are somehow fair, but most importantly, you've got to find a way to know what those different needs are, but you also have to find a way to communicate the decisions that are being made. Because as we found out, even in our search for our superintendent, one of the folks, that was on the search team, said the single most controversial issue presented to the community was the definition of equity, or the lack of understanding of it. So this is going to be tested out, as has been for 3 or 4 or 5 years now. And this year, I think we'll see it in its kind of in its full growth and full flowering. That's what I mean by a transformative budget. Thank you.
So let me add a little bit of historical. The reason that list came up was because as a financial professional, I deal in dollars, I deal with concrete numbers. And equity, in my mind, is more like beauty. That's the eyes of the beholder, because it's different for everybody. And I had a really hard time coming up with financial measures to track equity. And so that list to the left was us saying, okay, well, what do we spend money on? What we think would qualify for equity. We started labeling all those things because those were above and beyond the normal school operational stuff. And I was trying to use that information and come up with a formula, because that's what I do, right? And the superintendent Mitchell at the time, she's like, Jen, just ask the schools, they know what they need. And so we came up with the request form. The problem with that is at the end of the 3rd year, everybody was asking for the same things. And so it was no longer equitable, right? And so I thought, well, if every school is asking for tutoring, why aren't we providing tutoring as a base? and let the equity be the things that need on top of it. And so that's when we started coming up with the budget tiers. And if you flip to the next slide, Superintendent Wright's going to talk about our equity index.
Yeah.
So taking all of those things into consideration, beginning to think about at the beginning as we think about challenges that our schools face and some of the work that they have to work through depending on the students they serve. You know, all of us sitting here have worked with schools for a period of time, and we know that not all schools are created equal. The experiences that happen in schools are not all created equal. The students that show up to school buildings are not all the same. And so when we're talking about created equal, I mean the kind of experiences that they have are different. And so if you're working in a school that is stereotypically a Title I school, for example, there are sometimes some nuances and things that happen in those school environments that may not always be the norm in other places. And so really trying to look at it from an entry point of saying, okay, we did this process before, and doing this process before, we asked the schools what it was that they needed at that time, and then at the end of that process, we recognized many of them were asking for some of the same things. Now we want to look at it in a different way and look at it in a proactive way in terms of thinking about the diverse needs of schools, what's happening in school buildings with the students that they're serving, and how might we be able to utilize funding through the budget to address some of those nuances that are happening in schools. So our initial proposed equity index includes the areas of support that we're providing to students based on the needs in the school. So it starts with your free and reduced lunch population because inherently there is some additional work sometimes, that support that has to be provided around your free and reduced lunch population. Looking at the current enrollment, the sheer number of students that are in a school building. And so that's not to be discounted. We really want to think about where is the enrollment now? How many students are schools actually seeing on a day-to-day basis? What are they projected for next year? Are they projected more students? And are we thinking about that going in? So it's something that we're doing proactively, not something that we're doing after the fact. While it's really one that's probably more controversial than many, well, where are we in terms of report card grade? And what do we need to provide in the area of support to really work with increasing the overall outcomes for our students? What is the composite reading score? What is the composite math score in the buildings? Because that's looking at all of the students that are being assessed and what that assessment looks like. Housing stability or housing instability in the schools. As students, you know, we have some of our students that have experiences with housing insecurity. And so how are we providing the additional support to them at a school-based level so that they are able to get what they need so they're academically successful? And of course, our students with disabilities, as well as our students that are English language learners. What enrollment, what percentage of the enrollment is that? Because those things do call for something different.
So thank you for that. I think we were going to pause here and take some questions.
I think we probably should. I do have one question though about this equity index. This is what is being proposed to utilize for the budget coming up.
This is a draft of ideas that we've come up with. We're looking at the data, and then there's going to be a series of engagement and adoption, making it, because with the first look at the data, it came out really bizarre, because what I realized was the size of the building has an inverse relationship. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the biggest schools were going to get the most money. And so the first item, and then we didn't all agree on the weighting of each item. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that we're taking this, we just finished this class, Dr. Moffitt, myself, assistant treasurer, and our director of financial technology took an genomics class from Georgetown University. And they're trying to teach people across the country about return on investment, per pupil spending, how to evaluate, what are the significant factors in that. And they talk about the economic disadvantage percent is the highest impact on student outcome. And so while those other factors are important and they have a lot of impact on the way things go, they're saying the single most is the economic disadvantage. So we have some work to do to finish out our model and then start vetting it through different collaborative groups.
Is there a a model that's already being utilized across the nation somewhere for an equity index? My first thought is like, no, because I look at some of those on the list and I'm like, wow, they're really, you've already done that. Projected enrollment, size of the building. I mean, some of those are very, report card grade, those are very finite and they would definitely
Right.
skew the data. So I'm just wondering, from a community standpoint, is there a model that is already there that could be tweaked?
I haven't seen one, but I know that Superintendent Wright has done this in her previous district, and so maybe you can answer that better.
Thank you. I think to the point, I think that that's a part of the value of previous experiences, because this is, the now third district that we will be having these kind of conversations around and really beginning to learn from the lessons learned. So if you notice, one of the first things that was on the chart was the economically disadvantaged, and that's determined based on the percentage of free and reduced lunch. That's not to say that there cannot be and there's not success with students that there is a larger population of students that are in a free or reduced lunch scenario. But the difference is, in which I would imagine why this was called out in the course that you were in, is it becomes all of the other factors that become impacting factors as you're working in the school building and in the school site. And so that becomes really an area to take into consideration as you're looking at support, as you're looking at behavior, as you're looking at needs for both enrichment, remediation, and recovery. So that would be one of the areas. So I don't think, to Dr. Moffat's question, I don't know that I've ever seen one particular way that this is done in terms of equity. I think a lot of people talk about it, but it's challenging because, to our treasurer's point, everyone wants equity until it's not equal. And that really becomes a reteaching and a retraining process, because in order for us to operate within a budget, we have to operate with finite numbers. So, Dr. Moffat referred to these things are very finite. As you're building a budget, we have to be able to do that based on finite. We have to have a snapshot. We have to have a period in time that we are looking at, even for building the budget. It starts with October. So even though things change, students enroll, students withdraw, but that snapshot determines how we're going to get our additional funds, how we're going to get funds, and then how we're able to allocate those funds from there. So really thinking about an index really does offer you the same. The other thing about it that's also important, and as we move through the process, move through discussions, and if we actually, this is where we end up, the other thing that's also possible is that we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So the other part of that becomes, after you have a year or so of doing these particular equity indexes, you then really have to take a look at the data, because as you begin to see improvements in student outcomes, as you begin to see improvements across the board, many of those things are then tied back to some of the very same initiatives that were put into place and that overall equity index. So you would expect to see that you're going to see some increases in some areas and some decreases in some other areas. For example, you would expect to see an increase across the board, an increase in student performance. At the same time, you may also see an increase in enrollment. But you may see a decrease in the percentage of students that are in a school building that are free or reduced lunch, or students that have special needs or English language learners. So it's really the balance and the consistent conversation, and really being able to use that data point as a data point that you're using to reference overall improvement.
I think that's very clear, and everything is really, how shall we say, kind of, everyone understands that the issue of economic disadvantage shows up, unfortunately, in almost any measure or test. Certainly in the Ohio report card, a lot of people believe it's really a measure of wealth more than it is necessarily instruction. And we get very upset when people say, well, you have failing schools. We have lowly rated schools, in part because that test is not necessarily, in that report card, isn't reflective of what our young people know as much as it's reflective of where they live and how much income is in that family and the challenges that they face on a daily basis. And that's why, as we say, transformative budget, we have to figure out the things that are impacting poverty and housing, as has been mentioned. we have to figure out those things too that impact health. That's the whole child piece that the superintendent has mentioned. But we have to kind of go to those root causes of some of the issues. Could we spend significant amount of more money on real, in-depth, detailed vision testing that could actually directly impact achievement? And then also is our K-8 system and then 9-12 or 7-12, are these the schools that we really want? A lot of people believe, and I think the superintendent talked about having middle schools. Or should we consolidate some schools? Should we make sure that there are enough staffing and a school is large enough to have full staffing? So there's all kinds of interesting things that impact that equity piece. And I'm thrilled that the board wants to face that, and also that the superintendent and the treasurer are working so hard on that.
I don't know if I'm thrilled that we want to face it, because it's definitely something that's a heavy topic, but I think we've dedicated as a board to face this transparently with the community engaged and involved and aware. We've been doing these town halls, and so we're educating on all the facets of the finances of the district and being very transparent in how we come to the decisions that we make, in addition to inviting the public to join us, ask questions, the hard questions too. And then the academic piece, we've always stated that we're not where we need to be, and we are again being transparent with some of the things that we've got going on that are not where we want them to be, but also how can we work on that and how can we fix it. So do we have any questions, Rob? Mark?
Yes, we do. And since you were just talking about equity index, I'm going to direct this question. How does the district budget to support student programs like Project Connect? Is it specific to the equity index? How do you prepare for something so fluid?
So let's go first with defining what Project Connect is, because we need to define that for our members community that are in the community that are watching. Project Connect is, you want to take that one?
I will. So Project Connect is our program that supports our students that are experiencing housing insecurity. And for some that are not familiar with the new term around housing insecurity, that's one that's really started to really become more known and more widespread in the last several years. It would be homelessness for students that are experiencing homelessness. So there are grant funds. There are a small amount of grant funds that do come in specifically for us to support students that are in our Project Connect program, students that have experiences and they're going through different experiences in terms of their housing insecurity. But this particular index, for example, and what the district has done over a period of time is also look at other ways that we're able to provide support to those students as well. And so we do that through really the general fund budget. We do that through Title I, through our title budgets as well, to make sure that we are looking at the diverse needs of the students. That is a very good one as we think about, because it is something that has to be redetermined each year. And so it's very, very fluid. And that's understandable, because just because there's insecurity this year, we cannot assume that there will be insecurity next year as well. And we also have students, unfortunately, that throughout the year, they may start where they're not experiencing insecurity, but throughout the year, they actually do get to the point where they're experiencing insecurity. I think the one thing that's important here in terms of budget supports, because there are quite a few resources that are able to support our students that are going through housing insecurity. One of the things that's really important here, like a lot of the things that we'll talk about in terms of getting additional support or looking at disadvantages, is there is still a stigma that goes along with housing insecurity. And so it's important that if we have a family that is experiencing homelessness, they're experiencing insecurity, that's communicated. It's communicated at the school level. We have a way to communicate it on our website directly so that families can share with us, because that becomes the initiation of the additional support and additional resources.
But I also want to add that Superintendent Wright shared, that is a very great example of how the index would need to be flexible. And to Board Member Bolton's point, we haven't decided on any model to use yet. This is just discussions. So those things coming up are definitely impacting the index that would be used and all of those factors. So that's a big one. That's a very big one. Jen, did you have anything? Board Member
It
Bolton?
was a great question. We have another one? Or do you want to say something?
Real quickly, I would also add it's a great example of a fabulous partnership that we have regarding Project Connect. And also, as we face our troubles as we have with bus shortages and bus driver shortages, the federal government requires that we get our kids that are experiencing homelessness to school. And it is a requirement. And again, I think the partnership and the demands are very great.
Another question?
Yeah, and you've already alluded to talking about special education, but one of the questions was, does CPS have to budget special education services for students that are not enrolled at CPS but reside within our district?
The answer is yes. There is still quite a bit, probably about $10 million, if I'm not mistaken, that is passed through from state and federal grants, and it goes directly to the non-public schools or where those students are being educated, so that we are helping to support those services. Did you want that? Parochial and private, yeah, thank you.
So I just want you to kind of repeat that again, because the public does not completely understand that our budget is impacted by things that do not directly impact our students or affect our students.
Right, so it's about $10 million, and we call it auxiliary services. So they're services that are provided outside of our school district at the parochial and private schools. We are also paying for their transportation. So we are responsible for transporting all student residents and where they go. So we're not just transporting just the CPS students, and that helps drive our budget up as well.
Okay.
How do schools get music and the arts funded?
So music and the arts, if we go back to the slide that referenced the beginning of the equity conversations, that was one of those that was pulled out to make sure that there was an expansion of music and art. And currently, as we look at our allocations for schools, all of our schools have an allocation that is built into their budget to specifically support both music and art. And when we say art, we're talking about like our 2D art or drawing and those kinds of things. So there is performing art, and then there is also our visual art. And so that's already built in. We call it PAM, which is physical education, art, and music. And it's currently, it's built automatically into the budget. So as schools are thinking about what it is they want to offer in their school, how that looks in their school, they, at least as they're building their individual budgets, have to include those areas as a part of their budget.
So if we want to flip to the slide that says school budget building process, we'll talk a little bit about process.
I was thinking that same thing. Slide 11 talks about that.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so like I said before, the process starts with student projections. That's based off the October extract, and we use a 3-year history of promotion and retention to determine what our forecasted or projected students are for next year. So all that information is fed into the staffing formulas, and one of the staffing formulas is to have we call it a PAM allocation, PR music, but it also technology library. One position for every 7 load-bearing teachers. So the larger the school, the more load-bearing, and load-bearing is defined by people who give grades, are responsible for doing grades. So for every load-bearing teacher, every 7, they get 1 position to fund for the fine arts. And the ILT, the instructional leadership team, helps determine those choices. The board several years ago, I'm not sure if it's in policy or not, but said that every school had to have at least a half of each subject, so that you couldn't front load and have all music classes and not any PE or not any art. They wanted to have at least a half of a position for each of those, so that every child had access to those services, correct? So that's how the fine arts are funded. In addition, we have our performing arts school. But so after the staffing is done, So after the staffing is done, we give the schools a non-personnel per pupil allocation that changes a little bit every year based on available resources. And the ILT The school budget team determines how to allocate, how much money they put in mileage, how much they put in instructional supplies, classroom supplies, office supplies, field trips, anything else, coaching or instructional professional development stuff. The equity index is new, and so that's going to get layered on top of that. But so then we also preload the school budgets with things that are kind of contractual that, like in the collective bargaining agreement for the Cincinnati Federation of Office Professionals, there's a requirement that every school has to have X amount of overtime. And so we preload that into on top of all these allocations. We put in and do an analysis on how much home instruction extended time they need based on their history. We look at how much money do we put in the daily sub line based on teacher absences on the previous year and what that trend looks like. But we also have what we call super subs that sit on top of that. And that's allocated out based on the size of the buildings. And then, so the ILT puts together this budget. The LSD, the local school decision-making committee, helps inform that, and then they have to approve it before it comes back down to central office to be analyzed and consolidated. On top of all that, there are certain departments centrally that also allocate extra money out to individuals based on, like the Department of Student Services. So we have one-on-one paras that are driven by the IEPs. So they will go through and determine how many they need each year, where they are, and then they allocate them on top of their school budget. Another example is curriculum. When they do a textbook adoption, they'll budget it and allocate the money out to the schools. And then technology, the ITM department allocates technology services and support, desktop support services that way. And so it's not just the school budget, but the school budget plus. And I don't know that we've ever explained it that way, and all the roles that are involved in determining what a school budget. It's a very collaborative process.
I love it. I know Board Member Bolton is itching at the bait to talk about it from a historical perspective.
And this is such an important thing to understand the site-based decision making. You have to make sure that those decisions being made at the site not only meet board policy and the directives of the superintendent, but you also have to make sure that there's not any particular bias at every school building too, which plays into it regarding extracurricular funding, or whether or not they would like a different kind of support system rather than necessarily having another music teacher. So all that needs to be kind of watched and monitored, but it's great that things are happening at the school site. I do remember specifically when the PAM part came in, and that was I would say 14 to 13 years ago, when indeed it was decided by the board, and this is 3 or so superintendents ago, that there had to be art and music and PE, and we also said technology at every building. And that was a hard thing for a district to be able to do. Proud of that. But also, when you say you're going to give them that teacher, you have to build the school schedule so that the children have access to that teacher. So it's just very, very complicated, and the people that work through this in detail are gifted folks that have to figure these things out. But it's like pulling a thread, and very, very hard. But I don't know how many other urban districts actually can claim that there is art and music throughout the district, and some of these other things that we've been able to do.
And also, what's also significant that I hear is it's super important to recognize that the board took a very collaborative stance with the community years ago. I was only a parent at that time, and just an annoying helicopter parent, but that engagement at the school building level, that commitment to community involvement and engagement was very, very trendsetting, and to this day is very applicable. But to know, and I like how you broke that down, that the ILT is instrumental first in the budget, and then the LSDMC needs to look at that as well. And for the community, that's before it even gets down here to the central office. So the building and the community with the school are instrumental in looking at the funding and looking at what's needed in that building, and then they make that recommendation. So that's just super important to recognize that happened You want to keep going?
So once those budgets are submitted, we've spent several years creating what we call the budget quality control checklist, because invariably somebody will forget to budget something. And so we're trying to create these checklists to prevent that from happening. And we're also looking at, once they're all submitted, going back and calculating how much money are we spending per pupil on field trips, how much are we spending on instructional supplies, so that we can see equity across the district. And so there's a lot of data analysis that goes through. If you want to flip to the next slide for me. So on the central office side, we start our budget process with the board-defined budget priorities, either that are coming from the strategic plan or from superintendent's goals. So every department goes through and determines, so these are the priorities for the year, and this is how my department supports those priorities and how to support the schools. And so we determine staff and non-staff. And so how do we function at our best operation? What strategic initiatives do we need to start to support those budget priorities? And then, of course, the school allocations that I just spoke about, where individual departments allocate money out to the schools. So what's going to be really challenging this year is that we're starting with a zero budget for every department. And so in the past, we've kind of rolled over the staff and then let everybody add on their non-personnel items. And even prior to that, there's rolling over their budget and then increasing it by 1%. And so we're not doing that anymore. We're looking at every single line item. Superintendent Wright and I have looked at 884 vendor contracts, line by line, to determine whether is this taking us towards our outcomes or not. And so it's a different way of thinking. It's emotional for some people, and it is going to be a challenge to have to give up on things that are great things to do, but they're just not going to be part of our top priorities with shrinking funds. And so when Ms. Bolton talks about transformative, it's transformational across all lines and all departments. Well, so with that, I think we're going to pause to see if there's any more questions out there, or did anybody else want to add anything to that?
I think the only thing that I will add to that, for what our treasurer shared, is, and for our community partners that are listening, you know, it is when you start with zero and thinking about getting to some form of a modified zero budget, you're talking about starting over. And so essentially, you are looking at every line. You're almost wiping the slate clean and starting over. And so that's a very different approach than thinking about continuing what we've always done because we've always done it. As our teams, we started this process, we've been at this now about 2 or 3 months, if not longer, and it's every item. So for our partners that are watching as well, you know, the one thing that I think becomes a bit of a discomfort in terms of this space is that we'll be able to continue to support because we're able to clearly see the connection to the priorities, the connection to the guardrails, and there are some areas that we won't be able to continue to support, and making sure that we're very upfront and transparent about that. There are some things that we do in budget currently that we do through contracted services. And there are all kinds of ramifications that go along with that in terms of guidelines that we have to follow as a district when it comes to those contracted services and making sure that we are meeting the expectations of the law when it comes to staffing and financing and salaries and those kinds of things. So I would just say that as we're going through, you know, the overall processes, if you have questions, please ask those questions. As Board Member Moffitt shared, the town halls have been going on for a period of time. There are a lot of individuals that may not log on during this time, but they go back and they watch those town halls. Please feel free to interact at the school level as well, because their information is shared with them. Our treasurer gave the process. We start with the leader of the school, and that's the principal. So no, we don't pull everyone in the room and give all of them the information. The principal of the school is charged with being the one that begins to share the information with their team. And then from there, it goes to their instructional leadership team. And from the instructional leadership team, the local school decision-making team. So it's really important that if there are questions, start at the school site. ask questions there as well, and do tune in to the other updated sessions as they will be occurring through the town halls.
Do we have any
So
more
we've got-
questions from the public?
Yeah, yes, we do, but it's 7:01, so I think we can give at least one more
Ooh,
question in there.
Goodness.
Yeah, we've
And
done
give 'em
really,
a
really good.
little extra credit for our audience. When we think about how ESSER fits into the budgets, are there any significant areas that will probably be a focus for drastic reduction?
Bye.
So, we've talked a lot about the cliff. And so we are better than halfway through all of our ESSER funds. And so that cliff is already starting. And so there are things, and I've been saying this since day one, and so it should not be a surprise to anybody. One example is our nursing contract. But pre-COVID, we had a $1.4 million nursing contract. We contract with the city of Cincinnati for our school nurses. With the student wellness money that came, we were able to expand that a little bit. When COVID hit, we had ESSER, we were able to expand it a lot more. So we went up to almost an $8 million spend by putting a nurse in every building instead of shared across buildings. We can't sustain that level now when ESSER goes away. So I'm not suggesting that we cut all the nurses, but we're going to have to make spending decisions about whether this is a priority, we want to continue at this level, and what are we not going to do in order to pay for that. A lot of the money that we've been spending on from ESSER on the cleaning and the masks and all that kind of stuff is getting smaller as the pandemic has started waning. We're spending a lot of money on construction projects to help with social distancing, and so those aren't recurring expenses. We tried to be very careful about not spending things on recurring expenses, but we couldn't do it everywhere.
Real quickly, I would just also add, beyond cuts, another thing with this team that we have is cost savings through reorganization, consolidation, and we might be able to make more hay, so to speak, by doing that than even cutting if we think big and we think about the future, which is why this strategic plan process has been so important. Think in terms of cost savings through creative efforts as we transform our district.
So Rob, if you could just put the last slide up there, that's the schedule of all the next town halls. I would say if you have a question and you couldn't get it answered tonight because we ran a little bit over, sorry, you can email me at wagnerj at cpsvoe.k12.oh.us. You can find me. And we will make sure that it gets addressed in the next town hall.
And also, this last slide is super important because if you have a question about ESSER, we talked about that. We had a really, really, really robust town hall, September the 8th. I'm not exactly sure, Mark, where those are. If they're on the CPS website, they're definitely on YouTube, I think. So
if you go under district and then financial information on the left-hand side, it talks about the videos and the town halls.
Okay. So go back and watch those previous town halls because they've been really, 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 really good, and we've been getting some great feedback about that. But if you do have questions, check out those past town halls. We've got another one coming up February 28th where we will talk about state and federal grants. All of the committee reports, or the committee meetings for finance and the budget the videos are on the website. Get engaged. Don't wait till June and then ask a question when you see the budget and complain. Ask your questions now, and all of the information is available. Join one of the upcoming transportation town halls. We've got some community events going on. We do have some meetings that you can watch. We've got a CAL tomorrow, which is the Committee of the Whole, Student Achievement tomorrow, and then we've got a board meeting. Get involved. Send us your questions. Stay engaged so that you can help us make great decisions, and know and trust that everybody up here on this stage is making decisions that are student-centered, very, very focused on moving the needle for every student in our district. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really good. It's like I told you all if you watched the last one, I told you we'd be having some company up here. So maybe we'll have some more company or additional company, more of the same on our February 28th. But Make sure that you check us out. Thank you to everybody in the audience. I know there's so many people here that we just can't get to everybody, but thank you so, so much for your time and attention. Thank you, Board Member Bolton, Treasurer Wagner, Superintendent Wright.
Yes,
It has been my pleasure. Have a good night.
thank you.